I think it's really important for us to recognize that we're in the midst of a global health crisis. We have scientific evidence that we have a climate crisis. We have scientific evidence that we have an ecosystem crisis. But even more important is to recognize that these are intertwined crises that are occurring simultaneously, and that they're all manifestation of the fact that we're now in the Anthropocene, the new geological era that science has clearly shown evidence that we've entered, where we humans, anthros, are now the dominating force on planet Earth. So when you look carefully at COVID-19, we have enough evidence to recognize the fact that this is a zoonosis. It's a viral spillover from wild animals, potentially via domestic animals, to humans. It's related to unsustainable exploitation of natural habitats and ecosystems, and risky behavior in wet markets and wildlife trade, which then propels itself from one point on the planet across the entire world through this hyper-connected trade system and transport system we live in. And when you think very carefully about it, it's exactly the same thing with climate and environment. That today we must recognize that what happens with the West Antarctic ice shelf, or the rainforest, or the temperate forest, can send planetary invoices back that impacts the stability of the climate system and our life support system. So we have so much to learn from COVID-19 in this new integrated challenge that we're facing as humanity. So I think that's kind of insight number one. We have also so much scientific evidence that the food system is not only one of the large sectors in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it is the number one cause for losing biodiversity. So it is the big factor threatening rising frequency of future potential epidemics, pandemics. It's also the number one consumer of fresh water. It's the number one reason why we are over polluting with nitrogen and phosphorus, another greenhouse gas, by the way. And it's also a fundamental cause for land use change in the world. So to put it simple, if we fix the food system, we also fix a large portion of the stability of the Earth system, and thereby also contributing significantly to the planet. But even, that the final battleground, whether or not we're able to deliver on the Paris Agreement, is no longer whether we are able to decarbonize the energy system. It's really whether the transformation of the food system will or will not succeed. Just to give you a few numbers here, we know so far, over the last 150 years, that roughly 50%, even a bit more actually, of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've caused through fossil fuel burning are absorbed on land, in natural ecosystems, and in the oceans. The biggest subsidy to the world economy. Now, if you look into the future, if we want to, have a nature system that is able to continue providing us with this tremendously important carbon sink, we must manage nature in a sustainable way. And agriculture is the prime candidate to succeed with that. We've just recently mapped what we call the irrecoverable carbon sources, which is the carbon sinks in ecosystems on land that are so stable that it's very difficult for us to replace them if we lose them. We're talking permafrost soils, we're talking about some of the old forest systems, we're talking about some of the wetland systems. They correspond in the latest publications to roughly 280 gigatons of carbon. Now that number is just to compare with the fact that we've roughly added 280 gigatons of carbon through fossil fuel burning. So we have equal amounts of stored carbon in really sensitive ecosystems on the planet as we have burned since the Industrial Revolution. And all of this connects with food. So there is a very strong link here. Obesity is on the rise, diabetes is on the rise, cardiovascular disease is on the rise because of unhealthy food, which makes us more vulnerable to other shocks and stresses, such as pandemics, for example. So if you want to have a kind of a healthy, more resilient future, we better invest both in healthy and sustainable food for people and planet. There's quite an exciting and strong scientific agenda here. Number one, which I think is perhaps the most important, is that when you take all the environmental research and the climate research and the evidence we have, it points us in a direction that we now must seriously consider and understand that from now onwards, we need to feed humanity from current farmland, not allow continued expansion of agricultural land into natural ecosystems. That basically that the remaining natural ecosystems are so precious for the resilience of the planet and the climate system, we need to maintain them. And the numbers here are quite clear. We have transformed roughly 50% of the world's terrestrial area. And now it's basically time to be clever in what I call sustainable intensification, to be able to provide increasing food for growing populations. That's number one. Number two is to deploy all the practices. And it's quite interesting to see there are so many research publications now showing that we know from water harvesting systems, better crop rotations, conservation agriculture, avoiding plowing, to have minimum tillage, to build organic carbon. We have really exciting research on perennial staple food crops, like, for example, perennial wheat and maize, that could be a game changer in terms of organic carbon and building up more productive plants. We have so much biotech research that is very debated still, but can really be breakthroughs also on more resilient, high-performing crops in a more unstable future. So there are many practices that we can deploy, and recent papers show that 30% of farmers across the world are experimenting with different forms of sustainable agriculture. And then my final advice would just be withdraw all the subsidies that are incentives for unsustainable monoculture, industrial, climate damaging production systems, and reroute those subsidies to make farmers real landscape stewards as much as possible. And I think that gives at least a few directions of travel. Well, let me start by concluding. In a way, it's a kind of a mixture of both a compliment and a concern that the European Union, through the Green Deal, through the 750 billion euros put on the table as a resilience recovery package after COVID-19, with its climate law, with the recent European Commission announcement of a 55% reduction of emissions by 2030, they position the European Union as the most prominent climate and sustainability leading region in the world. And the concern is that it's almost the only climate leadership in the world. And that is, of course, a big concern when we have entered the decisive decade when the world needs to cut global emissions by 50% in 10 years' time. So, of course, in that sense, it is a concern that the European Union is standing so alone with being such a front runner on trying to align its policies with science. So I'm the first one to commend the European Union in the direction of travel we're seeing today. Then there are, of course, things that I'm still concerned about also with what has been put on the table. And it connects quite closely with the food agenda that the European Union has been able to gradually decouple economic growth from emissions, particularly the emissions reported to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention. But it hasn't truly decoupled if we take into consideration changes in land use, food system, imports, and consumption, meaning net imports of goods to the European Union. So, of course, we cannot not claim yet that the European Union and citizens of the European Union have become, let's say, aligned with the planetary boundaries or with the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's much more to be done. And what was been announced now is actually a suggestion of reducing the European emissions by 55% compared starting from 1990. But because the European Union has already reduced emissions by 23%, the next 10 years is actually 55 minus 23, which is roughly 32, or to be quite precise, 32%, which is not such a large step away from the path that the European Union has been following for the past 30 years. And moreover, does not really align itself with what the world needs to accomplish over the coming 10 years. So I think there is still issues to discuss. That's one issue. I think it's really important that the European Union now connects with allies around the world to recognize that it's an export-import union, that can constructively get alignment with other nations' efforts of taking on the same type of climate laws. And then finally, I think what all of us are having in mind, which is there's a lot of very nice rhetorics. Now is the question of really seeing the investments and the action behind this. And I would suggest that one of the first things to do is to really put up, very, very serious quantitative monitoring schemes, very serious science-based targets for 2025, 2030, 2035, to really be serious in all sectors of the pathway. I mean, take just the mobility sector, which is not even included yet in the discussions on both shipping and aviation, but then you have the whole car and heavy vehicle sectors. I mean, these are, fundamental sectors. The private sector is ready to start really rising, but we don't really see yet the connection between the policy and the investments required for example, electric mobility. The food sector is the same. Here we have a whole sector that needs to transform over the next 10 years in both land use, which we discussed earlier but also in energy use. How can we put the policies in place and the milestones in place to enable the whole value chain from farm to fork to be decarbonized in pace with that cutting emissions by half every decade? So we're in a situation where there's still a lot to be proven, and I think that's where the science, policy, business interface is really important.
Vuela Chimbilaco, vuela Chimbilaco, vuela Chimbilaco.